By 1942, the British Special Operations Executive had set up many networks throughout Europe to help organise resistance and conduct acts of sabotage behind enemy lines to weaken the resolve of the German army. These networks and circuits spread all across Europe had one major problem. They all needed to be supplied. And for an S.O.E. agent, there were a few ways that you could call for supplies. You could have modified bombers dropping supply canisters. Sometimes these were large metal tubes with multiple compartments or one big compartment. You also had wicker baskets. These would be thrown out of planes in designated drop zones that had been organised by the resistance unit, which would then be collected. These worked very well, however, a lot of equipment was lost to the Germans, as it was always a race against time to get to the supplies before the Germans found the drop sites. Another option, also by air, would be to ask for a Lysander to fly in and drop supplies. These couldn't carry as much, they were much smaller aircraft, but these could actually land on a designated runway that had been cleared by the resistance and then be able to take off again within a few minutes. But they had a much smaller carrying capacity. This was usually used for dropping agents off with some supplies, swapping agents in the field, bringing agents back to England for debrief or even just to rest if they'd been in country for too long. The problem with dropping supplies from the air is you're putting pilots at risk. S.O.E. didn't have its own air force, they relied on the Royal Air Force. They would ask them to drop supplies and pick up agents. Special Duty Squadron at Tempsford did a lot of this. However, the RAF weren't very supportive because they saw it as a waste of their men and a waste of their time, putting their men at risk, flying over anti-aircraft batteries when they didn't need to. They didn't see the point particularly. And it wasn't until later in the war when Churchill was kind of convinced and prodded a bit that he actually demanded that the RAF step up their support and actually help S.O.E. more. The third option, which wasn't used as often, would be to use the sea, bring supplies in by boat, and bury them on beaches for the resistance to come and dig up later. This was known as lardering. MI6 had a base in Dartmouth that specialised in taking agents across mainly and bringing people back who had information, any sort of intel that they could use. They would sometimes take supplies over. S.O.E., especially down here on the south coast, had a private flotilla, the Helford Flotilla, that specialised in taking agents across mainly to the Brittany coast. That was their kind of area. And they would take agents across, pick agents up, pick up refugees who might have information. If the resistance wanted someone out, they would do that. They were always kind of butting heads with MI6 because they were doing very similar things, but MI6 thought that S.O.E. were drawing too much attention. They were too loud and they were going to sabotage things and blow things up, which draws too much attention. The act of burying supplies on beaches wasn't widely successful because you were always at risk of being discovered because there was an exclusion zone along pretty much the entire of the coast of France. So the Germans had stepped up their security. However, there are stories of people being allowed to conduct their operations. There's one story of an S.O.E. boat that used to drop their supplies off 40 feet from a German pillbox. And it's because they'd actually made a deal with the German. He'd seen them coming ashore one night, and he thought, I don't want any trouble, I'm not going to start a fight. So he let them carry on dropping supplies there for ages, and he used to go and have a chat with them. Just goes to show that though we were very successful at what we were doing, it just shows that the unwilling Germans helped a lot of our success. But where I'm stood right now is a place called Kennock Sands. And round the corner of the peninsula that you can see behind me is where the Helford Flotilla was based. And we actually have a copy of the logbook, a form of logbook. I'm not convinced it's actually a logbook. It's a very odd type of report. It's not very well structured. People come and go without being logged in, so I think it was more almost a personal account maybe. But we have a copy of this logbook. We have a copy of this account that goes through the day-to-day training, cleaning, preparations that the Helford Flotilla actually went through. It's quite an interesting document. It does kind of go to highlight that they didn't have a lot to do, especially because the Helford Flotilla was actually scaled right down by Dartmouth, by Captain Slocum in Dartmouth, who was running operations there. He took over control, essentially, of the Helford Flotilla towards the end of 42, and by 43, operations here were pretty much non-existent. There was a lot of training, not a lot of going back and forwards to France. But we have a copy of their log, and it says that they had a few successful operations. That I believe one was called Carpenter, where they went buried some supplies on the Brittany coast. However, the reason I'm stood here today at a place called Kennock Sands is because here is where Operation Zebra took place. And Operation Zebra was a training exercise to see if they could bury supplies on a beach undetected practice basically being able to dump the supplies there. But they would have come around this peninsula. It'd have been night time by this point. They'd have waited a long time. 2 agents had already been dropped here to act as kind of guards that they had to work around. They would have come in, and their plan was to bury the supplies in a sand pit just up from the beach, as the tide wasn't particularly favourable. I believe this sand pit has actually gone at some point now, because there's sandy grassland behind the beach, and the beach itself, there doesn't seem to be a specific area that's separate that seems to be mentioned in the logbook. Once the operation was done, they felt they couldn't leave the supplies here on the beach, as they did sometimes, to see how conditions affected supplies after a certain amount of time. They felt they couldn't do that on this beach, as just over this rise that is behind the camera, there is actually a holiday park, and that holiday park was here during the Second World War, and they felt that some tourists might come snooping and find these buried supplies. During the operation, the 2 scouts, who were meant to be acting almost in place of the Germans, did stumble across the patrol, who, in a true S.O.E. fashion, killed them, and left them here as casualties, and used that as part of the training exercise to say that they could still carry out their mission even if they had been detected. However, one of these scouts, I believe it was one of the scouts, had a worse deal than the rest of them, as he was actually left here overnight, as they forgot he was there. He was obviously around a corner somewhere, and they thought they'd picked up their supplies and all of their men, and they left, and he had to be picked up the next morning. Kenneck's is also quite interesting in terms of Second World War history, as it has a few coastal defences, and there is an anti-tank wall just at the far end of the beach. There's not much of it left now. I'll get some closer footage of it in a moment. But there is actually an anti-tank wall built here. Not quite sure why particularly. There is a valley that heads up and further inland, but if you've ever been to this part of Cornwall, the Lizard Peninsula, there is nothing here. There is a airbase, there's RAF Predanic, but it's not a particularly valuable target. There are some radar sites about, but you wouldn't land an invasion force here, and you certainly wouldn't land armour here. If you manage to get past the anti-tank wall, it is just marsh and heathland. You would struggle getting anywhere. By the time that you'd got off the beach, you'd have been spotted, and as you can see, it's quite a small beach. You couldn't land any sort of significant force here, maybe a small commando raiding force, but they'd have a minimum distance of at least 10 miles before they got to anywhere of any use.
It was at this point the heavens decided to open and soak me and my camera and everything that I had, so I had to cut my journey a little bit short. But hopefully from this video you got a kind of basic gist of how S.O.E. used to supply its agents in occupied countries, and also the small part that this Cornish beach played in the training of that. And now I'll leave the video with the page of the logbook if anyone's interested in having a read through it. It is fairly interesting, and I hope to see you in the next video.